Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what time you are currently listening to this, and where you're listening from. Now, let's get right into the story. The screen door clicked shut behind her, and Maria Rodriguez stepped into the last ordinary moment of her life. It was 4:37 p.m. on Tuesday, October 17, 2023. The autumn light in Oak Haven, Ohio, was doing what it always did at that hour, turning the oak-lined streets into something that looked lifted from a postcard, the kind of golden hour glow that made even the cracked sidewalks and sagging chain-link fences look warm. Maria walked east on Elm Street, her backpack heavy with nursing textbooks, the smell of fried onions and coffee still caught in the fibers of her blue hoodie from her shift at Rosie's Diner. Her worn Converse scuffed the pavement in the rhythm of someone who'd walked this route 1,000 times and could do it with her eyes closed. She was 19 years old, a first-year nursing student at Oak Haven Community College. She lived with her mother, Elena, and her younger brother, Mateo, in a two-bedroom house 3 blocks from where she was walking now. Her father, Javier, had died of pancreatic cancer when Maria was 12, and the loss had done to the Rodriguez family what a fault line does to bedrock. Split it, shifted it, but ultimately made the remaining structure harder. Elena had picked up double shifts at the garment factory. Maria had learned to cook dinner, help Mateo with homework, and hold the household together with the quiet competence of someone who had been forced to grow up ahead of schedule. She didn't resent it. She wore it the way she wore everything, lightly, practically, without complaint. Her phone buzzed. A text from her best friend, Adriana, a goofy selfie caption with a complaint about their anatomy professor. Maria smiled, typed a quick reply, and looked up on the screen just as the streetlights began their early evening flicker. The dark sedan was already beside her. It had pulled up from behind, engine barely audible, coasting to match her walking pace. The passenger window was down. A man's voice said something. Later, she wouldn't be able to remember what. She turned her head. In the half second it took her brain to register that the voice didn't belong to anyone she knew. 2 things happened simultaneously. The rear door opened, and a hand closed over her mouth. The grip was enormous, calloused, smelling of cigarette smoke and something metallic. A second hand clamped around her midsection and pulled. Maria fought. She kicked, twisted, drove her elbow backward, and felt it connect with something solid. But she weighed 115 pounds. And the man pulling her into the car did not, and the physics of the situation were catastrophically one-sided. Her backpack caught on the door frame for one desperate second. Textbooks, pens, a thermos of coffee, the entire architecture of her normal life jammed between her and the dark interior of the car. And then the strap snapped, the backpack fell to the sidewalk, and Maria Rodriguez was inside. The door slammed. The sedan accelerated. The whole thing, from the moment the car pulled alongside her to the moment it disappeared around the corner of Elm and Birch, took 11 seconds. A neighbor's security camera, mounted above a garage door across the street, captured all of it, though the footage wouldn't be discovered for another 14 hours. Nobody on Elm Street saw it happen. Elena Rodriguez knew something was wrong at 6:15 p.m. when the chicken soup she'd left simmering on the stove had reduced to a thick paste and Maria still wasn't home. Maria was never late. Maria was the kind of person who texted if she was going to be 5 minutes behind schedule. Not because she was anxious, but because she understood that her mother worried and she loved her mother enough to make the worry unnecessary. By 7 p.m., Elena had called Maria's phone 9 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. By 8 p.m., she'd called Adriana, who confirmed that Maria had never arrived at the library where they planned to study. She'd called the diner, where the manager confirmed Maria had left at 4:30, same as always. She'd called Mateo's school, the community college, the emergency room at Oak Haven General. By 10:17 p.m., Elena Rodriguez was standing at the front desk of the Oak Haven Police Department, her hands shaking so violently that the duty officer had to help her fill out the missing persons report. She was 46 years old, with dark hair threaded early with silver, and the face of a woman who had already survived one catastrophic loss and could feel, with the animal certainty of a mother, that another one was bearing down on her. She wouldn't do this, Elena told the officer. Her voice was steady in the way that a bridge is steady, holding but under strain that was visible if you knew where to look. She doesn't disappear. She doesn't call. Something has happened to my daughter. The duty officer, to his credit, listened. He noted Maria's age, her reliability, the deviation from routine. He flagged the report as urgent. By midnight, patrol cars were canvassing Elm Street. By 2 a.m., a detective had been called in. Detective Anya Sharma arrived at the Rodriguez home at 6:45 a.m. on October 18th. She'd spent the previous 3 hours reviewing the initial report, pulling Maria's phone records, and requesting CCTV footage from every business within a half-mile radius of Elm Street. She was 38 years old, Indian American, with an athlete's build and the particular stillness of a person who has trained herself to absorb information before reacting to it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail. Her blazer was practical, her shoes flat-soled. She carried a notebook. She still preferred paper, and she listened more than she spoke. Sharma had been with the Oak Haven PD for 11 years, the last 4 in investigations. She was not the most senior detective in the department, but she was the one the chief called when a case required patience, precision, and the ability to sit with a grieving family without flinching. She had that ability because she understood grief. She'd lost her own sister in a hit-and-run when she was 22, and the driver had never been found. The case that made her a detective was also the case that haunted her, and she carried it the way Elena carried Javier's absence, not as a wound that had healed, but as a fracture that had become part of the structure. Elena met her at the door. She hadn't slept. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before, a cardigan over a faded blouse, and she was holding a framed photograph of Maria, a school portrait, Maria smiling in her graduation cap, the kind of photo that parents keep on a mantle because it captures the precise moment when their child looks most like the person they're becoming. "Tell me about Maria," Sharma said. Elena told her everything. The diner shifts, the nursing classes, the study group that met on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The walk home along Elm Street, always the same route, always between 4:30 and 5 p.m. Maria's phone habits, her friendships, her plans. The full, vivid portrait of a 19-year-old life. Ordinary in its details, extraordinary in its potential. Sharma wrote it all down. Then she asked the question she always asked, the one that made most people pause. Is there anyone who might want to hurt Maria? Anyone who's shown unusual interest in her? A customer at the diner? A classmate? Someone in the neighborhood? Elena shook her head. Then she stopped. There was a man, she said slowly, at the diner. Maybe 2 weeks ago. Maria mentioned him. She said he sat in her section 3 days in a row and never ordered more than coffee. She said he stared at her, not in the way men sometimes stare. She said it was different. She said it felt like he was memorizing her. Did she describe him? Thin, older. She said he had a scar on his face. Above his eye, I think. Sharma wrote it down. She circled it. The CCTV footage from Elm Street arrived at 9 a.m. Sharma watched it in the department's tech room, the video playing on a monitor that made everything look slightly blue and grainy. The camera angle was imperfect, mounted above a garage, pointed toward the street at a downward angle, but it captured enough. At 4:41 p.m. on October 17th, a dark sedan entered the frame from the west, moving slowly. At 4:42, the sedan pulled alongside a figure walking east. Maria, identifiable by her blue hoodie and backpack. The rear passenger door opened. A figure emerged, tall, lean, moving fast. The struggle lasted seconds. The backpack fell. Maria was pulled into the car. The door closed. The sedan accelerated out of frame. Sharma replayed the footage 43 times. She freeze-framed the moment the rear passenger was visible outside the car. A man, tall and wiry, dark clothing, his face turned away from the camera. She freeze-framed the sedan, dark blue or black, four-door, make and model obscured by the angle and the failing light. She noted the license plate, partially visible, the last three characters blurred beyond recognition. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm what Elena already knew. Maria had been taken. Sharma escalated the case to the FBI field office in Cleveland by noon. By the following morning, Maria Rodriguez's photograph was on every news broadcast in northern Ohio, and the investigation had entered the phase that Sharma privately called the flood, the period when tips pour in by the hundreds, most of them useless, a few of them contradictory, and one of them buried somewhere in the noise, potentially the key to everything. The key, when it came, arrived through the diner. Rosie's Diner kept a basic security camera behind the register, pointed at the dining room. Sharma pulled 2 weeks of footage and ran it against Elena's account of the man who had stared at Maria. She found him on October 3rd, 5th, and 6th. The same man, seated in the same booth, ordering nothing but black coffee, his eyes tracking Maria as she moved between tables. He was exactly as Elena had described. Tall, thin, angular face, mid-40s. And on the October 6th footage, when he turned to leave, the camera caught his face in profile. Gaunt cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a thin scar bisecting his left eyebrow. The FBI's facial recognition database returned a match within 4 hours. Viktor Petrov, age 43, born in Odessa, Ukraine. He'd entered the United States on a tourist visa in 2016 and overstayed. His record was thin. A single arrest for assault in Newark, New Jersey. In 2018, charges dropped, but the file carried a flag from Interpol. Petrov was a known associate of an Eastern European trafficking network that operated across the Great Lakes region, specializing in kidnap for ransom operations targeting families they perceived as unlikely to involve law enforcement. Immigrant families, working-class families, families who might, out of fear or mistrust, try to handle things quietly. The network had a name in law enforcement circles, the Syndicate. Its operations were surgical, its members disciplined, its victims chosen with predatory precision. The ransoms were always calibrated to what the family could realistically pay. Never millions, always thousands, and the operations moved fast, typically resolving within 2 weeks. The victims were usually returned alive. Usually, Sharma stared at Petrov's photograph. The scar, the hollow cheeks, the eyes that looked like they'd been installed rather than grown, and felt the case shift beneath her. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This wasn't a disturbed loner acting on impulse. This was professional, planned, and it meant Maria was alive because dead hostages don't generate ransom payments. It also meant the clock was running. On October 22nd, 5 days after Maria's abduction, the ransom demand arrived. It came through a burner phone, a text message sent to Elena Rodriguez's personal mobile, a number that should have been private, its inclusion a deliberate message. We know who you are, we know where you live, we are closer than you think. The demand was $50,000, payable in cryptocurrency to a wallet address that the FBI cyber team immediately began tracing. The message included a photograph of Maria, pale, hollow-eyed, seated on a concrete floor, holding a copy of that day's newspaper. She was alive. She was terrified. Elena Rodriguez saw the photograph before Sharma could intercept it. The sound she made, a single sharp intake of breath followed by a silence, so total it seemed to absorb the noise from the room, was something Sharma would carry for a long time. "We're going to get her back," Sharma said. Elena looked at her. Her eyes, red-rimmed, exhausted, held a question that she didn't ask aloud. "How can you promise that?" Sharma couldn't, but she said it anyway because Elena needed to hear it and because Sharma intended to make it true. The cryptocurrency wallet was the thread that unraveled everything. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit traced the wallet through a series of exchanges and shell transactions designed to obscure its origin. The trail was sophisticated, layered, deliberately convoluted, but not impenetrable. Within 72 hours, analysts had linked the wallet to a cluster of transactions originating from IP addresses in rural Michigan. The addresses were masked by VPNs, but the VPN provider, served with a federal warrant, disclosed the underlying connection data. The IP addresses resolved to a region in the Upper Peninsula, a sparsely populated stretch of forest and defunct industrial sites north of Marquette. Simultaneously, Sharma's team had been working on the physical evidence. The sedan from the CCTV footage was identified as a 2014 Chevrolet Malibu, dark blue, with aftermarket tinting on the rear windows. A vehicle matching that description had been flagged by a highway toll camera on I-75 North at 8:47 p.m. on October 17th, 4 hours after Maria's abduction, heading toward Michigan. A second hit placed the same vehicle on a rural highway in the Upper Peninsula on October 19th, refueling at a gas station outside Madison. The station's camera captured the driver, Victor Petrov. The net was closing, but the geography was a problem. The Upper Peninsula was vast, over 16,000 square miles of forest, lakes, and abandoned infrastructure. Finding a specific building in that landscape was like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. They needed more. The ransom video provided it. Sharma had watched the video of Maria dozens of times, not looking at Maria herself. That was too painful and pain-clouded analysis, but listening. Beneath Maria's voice, beneath the room tone, there was a sound. Faint, rhythmic, mechanical. It took 3 days and a forensic audio specialist to isolate it. The distinctive low-frequency hum of a sawmill motor. Not an active mill. The frequency was irregular, suggesting an old motor running on a failing generator. But a specific type of motor, a band mill, the kind used in small-scale lumber operations that have been common in the Upper Peninsula in the mid-20th century. The FBI cross-referenced this with satellite imagery, decommissioned industrial records, and property databases. 3 sites matched. Abandoned lumber mills in the Upper Peninsula with structures still standing and recent signs of activity. Tire tracks, cleared access roads, generator fuel purchases at nearby stores. One of them, a site called Blackwood Mill, 18 miles northeast of Munising, accessible only by a deteriorating logging road through dense national forest, matched on every criterion. Property records showed it had been purchased 4 years earlier by a numbered LLC that the Financial Crimes Unit had already linked to the syndicate's network. Satellite imagery from the week prior showed a vehicle parked in the mill's yard, a dark sedan. Sharma briefed the tactical team on October 26th. The operation was planned for the following morning. 9 days. Maria Rodriguez had been missing for 9 days. In those 9 days, Maria had done what her captor did not expect, and what most people in her situation could not. She had refused to become passive. The place Petrov had brought her was a repurposed storage room in the Blackwood Mills main building. Concrete floor, cinder block walls, a single window, too high and too narrow to climb through. A heavy steel door secured from the outside. The room was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew and machine oil. Petrov visited twice daily to deliver food, stale bread, canned soup, bottled water, and to check her restraints. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice was flat and transactional, devoid of cruelty, but also devoid of recognition that she was a person. She was a commodity, a line item in a ledger that would balance once the money arrived. Maria cataloged him the way her nursing instructors had taught her to catalog patients, objectively, systematically, without letting emotion contaminate the data. His routine was precise. Morning visit between 7 o'clock and 7:30. Evening visit between 6 o'clock and 6:30. Each visit lasted no more than 10 minutes. He checked her wrist bindings, left the food, and exited without turning his back to her. He carried a handgun in a waistband holster, always on his right hip. He smoked. She could smell it on his clothes, but never inside the room. He was right-handed, favoring his right knee slightly when he crouched, suggesting an old injury. She also cataloged the room. The cinder blocks were old, the mortar between them crumbling in places. Near the back wall, at floor level, one block was visibly loose. The mortar around it had deteriorated to powder on two sides, and when Petrov was gone, Maria could work the block with her fingers, rocking it millimeter by millimeter. Behind it, she felt cold air. The wall backed onto the exterior of the building. If she could remove the block and the one beside it, the gap might be large enough to crawl through. It was a long shot. The blocks were heavy. Each one weighed at least 30 pounds, and she could only work on them during the 12-hour stretches between Petrov's visits, using a flattened piece of tin she'd pried from the edge of a food can. The mortar came away in grudging fragments, each one a minor victory that she measured against the clock in her head. She didn't know how much time she had. She didn't know if the ransom would be paid or what would happen to her if it was. She knew only that waiting for rescue was a strategy that depended entirely on other people, and Maria Rodriguez had spent her entire life learning not to depend entirely on other people. She worked on the blocks every night. She hid the debris in a crack between the floor and the wall. She kept her hand behind her back when Petrov entered, concealing the raw, bleeding tips of her fingers. And she waited. On the morning of October 27th, she heard the helicopters. The tactical operation began at 5:15 a.m. 3 teams, 2 ground units, and an aerial support team converged on Blackwood Mill from 3 directions, moving through the forest in the pre-dawn darkness. Sharma was with the command vehicle positioned on the logging road a half-mile south of the mill, monitoring radio communications and satellite feeds. She'd spent the previous night reviewing every detail of the operation plan, every contingency, every scenario in which things could go wrong. She'd also spoken with Elena Rodriguez by phone, not to promise anything. She was done making promises she couldn't guarantee, but to tell her that they knew where Maria was and that they were going in at dawn. Elena had been silent for a long time. Then she said, "Bring her home, detective." Sharma said, "Yes." The ground teams reached the mill perimeter at 5:28 a.m. The dark sedan was parked in the yard, frost on its windshield. No lights were visible in the building. The tactical lead confirmed positions and gave the go order. They hit the main door at 5:31 a.m. It was an old lumber mill. The entry points were industrial-sized, and the breaching team had the main door open in seconds. Inside, the building was cavernous, the old machinery still standing in rusted silhouette, the air thick with dust, and the smell of decay. Petrov was in a room on the second floor, a makeshift living space, sleeping bag on the floor, a camp stove, a laptop that would later yield a trove of communications with the syndicate. He came awake to the sound of boots on the metal stairs and reached for the handgun on the floor beside him. He got his hand on it. He did not get it raised. The tactical officers had him face down on the concrete within 4 seconds, his wrists cuffed behind his back, the gun kicked across the floor. He did not speak. He did not resist. His face, pressed against the cold concrete, carried the expression of a man who had always known this moment was possible and had simply been waiting to see when it arrived. Sharma was out of the command vehicle and moving toward the building before the suspect secured call finish transmitted. She took the stairs 2 at a time, past the room where Petrov was being held, and followed the tactical officers down a corridor to the storage room at the end. The steel door was bolted from the outside. Sharma threw the bolt and pushed the door open. Maria Rodriguez was standing in the center of the room, not sitting, not cowering, standing. Her wrists were bruised and raw, her face pale, her blue hoodie filthy, her dark hair matted. She was thinner than her photographs, and her eyes, the warm dark eyes that Elena had described with such love, held a depth that hadn't been there 9 days ago. The depth of a person who has seen the interior of something most people only read about and has come out the other side. Behind her, near the back wall, 2 cinder blocks lay on the floor, a ragged gap in the wall admitting a shaft of gray morning light. She had almost made it out on her own. Maria, Sharma said, "My name is Anya Sharma. I'm a detective with the Oak Haven Police Department. Your mother sent it to me." Maria's face did not crumble. It held the way a dam holds, the way a levee holds, the way anything holds that has been under pressure for so long that holding has become its primary function. She looked at Sharma, and her lips moved, and the words that came out were so quiet that Sharma had to step closer to hear them. "Is my mom okay?" Of all the things she could have said, "Help me, get me out, I'm hurt, I'm scared," she asked about her mother. Sharma felt something shift in her chest, a tectonic movement in the place where she kept the things she didn't let herself feel on the job. "She's okay," Sharma said. "She's waiting for you. Let's go home." Elena Rodriguez was at the Oak Haven Police Department when the call came. She'd been there since 4 a.m., sitting in Sharma's office in the same cardigan she'd worn the night Maria disappeared, the framed school portrait in her lap. Mateo was beside her, 16 years old, trying to be the man of the house the way his father would have wanted, his leg bouncing with a nervous energy he couldn't contain. The phone rang. Sharma's voice, steady but carrying something underneath the steadiness, something warm, something Elena hadn't heard before. "We have her. She's alive. She's safe." Elena pressed the phone against her ear with both hands, as if she could pull the words physically closer. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The sound she made, a single, broken exhale that carried 9 days of held breath and held terror and held hope, said everything. Mateo looked at his mother's face and understood. He put his arms around her, and they held each other in the fluorescent-lit office while the phone lay on the desk between them, Sharma's voice still coming through the speaker, describing helicopter transport, medical evaluation, estimated arrival times, the logistics of a miracle. Maria was transported to Marquette General Hospital, where she was treated for dehydration, malnutrition, soft tissue injuries to both wrists, and the early stages of hypothermia. Elena and Mateo arrived 6 hours later, having driven through the night with a police escort. The reunion happened in a hospital corridor because Maria had heard her mother's voice from inside the examination room and had gotten off the bed and walked out before anyone could stop her. They held each other for a very long time. Elena's hands moved over Maria's face, her hair, her shoulders, as if confirming through touch what her eyes couldn't quite believe. Maria was thinner, paler, older in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar. But she was here. She was breathing. She was her daughter. "I knew you'd come," Maria said. Elena shook her head, tears streaming. "You came to us, Mija. You were already fighting your way out." Viktor Petrov was charged with kidnapping, forcible confinement, extortion, and conspiracy. The investigation expanded over the following months, unraveling the broader syndicate network across 4 states. 7 additional arrests were made. The numbered LLC that owned Blackwood Mill was traced to a web of shell companies in 3 countries. Petrov offered a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation, provided testimony that led to the identification of 3 other victims who had been kidnapped and ransomed by the same network over the previous 2 years. All 3 had been returned alive. All 3 had been too frightened to report it. Maria Rodriguez was not too frightened. She gave her full statement from the hospital bed, her voice clear, her recall meticulous, the timings of Petrov's visits, the sound she'd heard, the layout of the building, the cinder blocks she'd been working loose when the tactical team arrived. The lead FBI agent told Sharma afterward that it was the most detailed and useful victim statement he'd received in 20 years of fieldwork. Sharma closed the Rodriguez case on a Friday afternoon in January 2024, 3 months after it had begun. She placed the file in the cabinet, sat at her desk, and looked at the photograph of Maria that was still pinned to her evidence board. The school portrait, the graduation cap, the smile. She thought about Elena, who had refused to be a passive observer of her own tragedy, who had plastered the town with flyers and gone on local news, and called the station every single day. Not because she didn't trust the police, but because she loved her daughter too much to let anyone else carry the full weight of finding her. She thought about Maria standing in the center of that storage room with 2 cinder blocks on the floor behind her and a gap in the wall she'd made with her own bleeding fingers, asking not "save me," but "is my mom okay?" And she thought about the gap between the world as it should be. A 19-year-old walking home from work on a Tuesday afternoon in a town where nothing ever happens, and the world as it is, where a dark sedan can pull up beside you and erase everything in 11 seconds. Sharma unpinned the photograph, held it for a moment, and placed it in the file with the rest. Then she closed the cabinet and picked up the next one. Outside, Oak Haven was doing what small towns do, carrying on. The diner was open. The streetlights on Elm Street were flickering to life. Somewhere, a screen door was clicking shut behind someone who was just walking home, backpack heavy, mind drifting, the ordinary world stretching out ahead of them like a promise. Maria Rodriguez was back in that world now. She'd re-enrolled at the community college for the spring semester. She'd gone back to the diner, back to the same section, back to the same walk home. Though Elena drove her now, every day without discussion, the car idling at the curb at exactly 4:30, the engine running, the door unlocked. Some promises don't need to be spoken. They just need to be kept. The footsteps didn't belong to the forest. Anya Petrova heard them before she saw anything. The crunch of heavy boots on dry leaves, deliberate and rhythmic, too measured for a moose, too heavy for a wolf. She straightened from the seismic sensor she'd been calibrating and scanned the tree line, her hands still dusted with granite fragment from the outcrop she'd been sampling all morning. She was alone. She was supposed to be alone. Her nearest scheduled check-in was 2 days away. The closest road was 40 kilometers south. The closest human settlement, a shuttered logging camp, was 27 kilometers east. She was deep in the boreal forest of northern Ontario, a week into a solo expedition mapping kimberlite formations near the northern reaches of Lake Superior. And the only sound she'd heard for 6 days were wind, water, and the occasional distant crack of a tree surrendering to its own weight. The footsteps were none of those things. "Hello," she called. Her voice was steady, louder than the situation demanded, the way her field safety training had taught her. "Make yourself known. Make yourself big. Don't let the silence do the other party's thinking for them. Is anyone there?" The forest answered with the kind of silence that follows a hell breath. Then a figure stepped out from behind a stand of black spruce, and Anya's training pivoted from scientific protocol to something far older. He was late 40s, maybe older, the kind of face the wilderness carves when it has years to work with. Gaunt but wired with a ropey, functional strength. Dark hair, unkempt, streaked with gray at the temples. He wore faded work clothes, heavy canvas trousers, a plaid flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, boots that had been resoled more than once. His hands hung at his sides, rough and oversized, the hands of a man who split his own wood and dug his own holes. But it was his eyes that stopped her, deep-set, dark, fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with ownership. Anya recognized him. 3 days earlier, at a gas station on Highway 11, the last outpost of civilization before the logging roads turned to dirt and the dirt turned to nothing. She'd seen this man. He'd been filling a battered jerry can at the pump, and when she'd walked past him to pay for her own fuel, he turned his head and watched her with that same unblinking stare. She noted it the way she noted everything, filed it, assessed the threat level as low, moved on. Field geologists working alone in remote Canada developed a taxonomy of human encounters, and a quiet man at a gas station ranked well below a surprised black bear. She'd been wrong to file him away. "You shouldn't be here," the man said. His voice was low, guttural, heavily accented, Eastern European, though she couldn't place the specific origin. Russian, maybe Ukrainian. The consonants landed like dropped stones. "This place is not for you. I'm a geologist," Anya said. She kept her voice even, her posture open, her weight balanced on both feet. "De-escalation. Assessment. Escape route." Her truck was parked 200 meters downslope, behind a ridge of exposed gneiss. Her satellite phone was in the truck. Her bear spray was clipped to her belt. "I have permits from the Ontario Geological Survey. I'm conducting research." The man didn't react to any of this. Permits, research, authority. These were words from a world he'd clearly left behind a long time ago. He took a step forward, then another. His movements were unnervingly quiet for a man of his build, each footfall placed with the care of someone accustomed to moving through the bush without being heard. "Research," he repeated, and the word came out stripped of meaning, almost mocking. "You trespass. You disturb what is mine." He was close enough now that she could smell him, wood smoke, sweat, and something metallic like old rust or dry blood. She saw a coil of heavy rope looped through his belt. She saw the way his right hand hung slightly forward, fingers loose, ready. Anya's mind did the math. 200 meters to the truck. Open ground for the first 60, then dense bush. She was fit, but he was lean and clearly knew this terrain the way she knew a stratigraphic column. Intimately, instinctively. If she ran, he would catch her before she reached the ridge. "I'll leave," she said, raising her hand slowly, palms out. "I'll pack up my equipment and go. I don't want any trouble." His eyes narrowed. Something shifted behind them. A calculation, a decision that had been made long before this conversation started. "No," he said. "You are here now." He moved fast, faster than she'd expected. Not a lunge, but a closing of distance that eliminated her options in the space of 2 strides. His hand closed around her upper arm with a grip that felt like a vice, and in the same motion he twisted her sideways, pulling her off balance, driving her toward the tree line. Anya fought, She drove her elbow back, connected with something solid, heard him grunt, but his other hand came up and caught a fistful of her jacket. And then she was being dragged, her boots cutting furrows in the forest floor, the canopy spinning overhead. She screamed. The sound hit the trees and died. There was no one to hear it. The forest swallowed it the way it swallowed everything, completely, indifferently, without echo. Her name was Anya Petrova. She was 32 years old. She was a geologist with the Ontario Geological Survey, engaged to a man named Michael Chun, who was at that moment sitting in their apartment in Toronto grading undergraduate papers, unaware that the woman he loved had just been dragged into the Canadian wilderness by a man whose name she did not yet know. She would learn it later, in the dark, when the pain had settled into something she could think around. His name was Dmitry Volkov, and the place he took her was a cabin that didn't exist on any map, in a stretch of forest that hadn't seen another human being in years. The cabin was less a structure than an act of stubbornness. Rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a tar paper roof patched with flattened tin cans, a single window so caked with grime it admitted light the color of old bruises. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by spruce, so dense the trees seemed to lean inward, as if trying to conceal the building from the sky. There was no road leading to it, no trail. Volkov had brought her through nearly 3 kilometers of trackless bush, and by the time he shoved her through the heavy wooden door and through the iron bolt behind her, Anya had lost all sense of direction. The interior was a single room, a wood stove in one corner cold, a makeshift cot against a far wall, a wool blanket folded on it with military precision, a workbench cluttered with tools, traps, and tin cans, a shelf holding a dozen books, their spines cracked and illegible, and on the wall beside the door, a row of nails holding coils of rope, a rusted handsaw, and a kerosene lamp. Volkov bound her wrists with a rope, not cruelly, but with the competence of a man who had tied things down in bad weather. He pushed her onto the cot, stepped back, and stood near the window, his silhouette cutting the dim light in half. "You will stay," he said. It wasn't a command. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same inflection he might use to describe the weather. Anya sat on the cot, her wrists burning, her arm throbbing where he'd gripped it, and forced herself to breathe. Panic was the enemy. Panic would cloud her observation, and observation was the only weapon she had. She began to catalog. The cabin's construction, old, at least 20 years, possibly more. The logs were hand-squared, the joinery rough but functional. This place had been built by one person over a long time with hand tools. The door was solid, thick planks, iron bolt, no give when she tested it with her shoulder on the way in. The window was too small to fit through, even if she could reach it. The floor was packed earth, except near the hearth, where someone had laid rough-cut planks. One of them, she noticed, sat slightly lower than the others, its edge worn smooth by the repeated scuff of a boot. Volkov himself. He moved through the cabin with the unconscious ease of long habit, each object in its place, each gesture practiced. He didn't behave like a man who had just committed a violent abduction. He behaved like a man who had brought something home. His agitation from the forest was gone, replaced by a settled, watchful calm that was somehow more frightening. He ate standing up, a can of beans spoon cold from the tin, his eyes never leaving her. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in fragments, clipped sentences delivered in that grinding Eastern European accent. "This place is mine. The land, the silence, it is all I have left. You do not belong, but you are here." The words suggested territory, possession, a grievance so old it had fossilized into identity. He wasn't ranting. He wasn't incoherent. He was a man who had built an entire world in this clearing, and Anya had walked into it uninvited. She needed to understand him if she was going to survive him. "What happened to you?" she asked on the second night, her voice quiet in the dark. The stove was lit now, the cabin filled with the smell of burning birch, and Volkov sat on a stump near the door, his face half lit by the orange glow. He didn't answer for a long time. When he did, his voice was different, lower, stripped of the territorial edge, almost hollow. "I had a life," he said, "before. A wife, a daughter, in Kharkiv. I came here to work. The mines. They promised me papers, a house. They gave me nothing. And then my family, they could not come. The borders closed. The wars came. I could not go back. I could not bring them here. So I came north. I built this. I waited. I am still waiting." It was the most he'd ever said. And in those sentences, Anya heard something she recognized. Not the voice of a predator, but the voice of a man who had been broken so thoroughly by loss that his grief had calcified into something indistinguishable from madness. He hadn't taken her because he wanted to hurt her. He'd taken her because she was there, because another human being had entered the radius of his solitude, and he didn't know how to let anything go anymore. This knowledge didn't make her safer. Grief-driven captors were less predictable than calculated ones, more prone to sudden violence when their constructed reality was threatened. But it gave her something to work with, a psychology, a pattern, a set of pressures she could learn to navigate. She filed it away the way she filed geological data, carefully, precisely, for future use. The satellite phone check-in that Anya missed was logged at the Ontario Geological Survey's Toronto office at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, 7 days after her last confirmed communication. The protocol was clear. A missed check-in triggered a welfare inquiry within 6 hours. By 10 p.m., the inquiry had escalated to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Detachment in Thunder Bay. Sergeant Elena Rossi received the file at 10:47 p.m. She was still at her desk. She was always still at her desk. The joke in the detachment was that Rossi's chair had a restraining order against her leaving, and she read the preliminary details with a focused stillness that her colleagues had learned to interpret as the precursor to action. Anya Petrova, 32, geologist, solo expedition in the northern Lake Superior region. Last confirmed contact, 7 days prior, a routine satellite phone update in which she'd reported she was moving to a new sampling site deeper into the survey zone. Her fiancé, Michael Chun, had reported her overdue 4 hours ago, his voice on the intake recording tight with a specific fear of a person who understands exactly how remote means in northern Ontario. Rossi pulled up a topographical map of the survey area and studied it. She'd worked search and rescue operations in this region before. She knew what the green on the map actually meant. Hundreds of square kilometers of boreal forest, muskeg, exposed rock, and water, accessible only by float plane, ATV, or on foot. The terrain was beautiful in the way that a glacier is beautiful, vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent to whether you lived or died within it. She called Dr. Jin Lee at 11:15 p.m. Lee was Anya's senior colleague at the survey, a soft-spoken geologist in his late 30s who had supervised her fieldwork for 3 years. He answered on the second ring. He'd been waiting for the call, Rossi realized. He already knew something was wrong. Her research station was in this grid, Lee said, his voice calm but wound tight beneath the surface. He gave her the coordinates. She was mapping kimberlite pipe formations, the geological structures associated with diamond deposits. The area is extremely remote. Access is limited to float plane or a 60-kilometer drive on decommissioned logging roads. Was she alone? Yes. She preferred solo fieldwork. She was meticulous about her safety protocols. check-ins every 3 days, detailed route plans, full emergency kit. For her to miss a check-in, he didn't finish the sentence. Any known hazards in the area? Other people, Lipauja. The area is largely uninhabited, but the local rangers and trappers have stories. There's talk of a hermit, a man living off-grid somewhere in the northern section. They call him the Ghost of the North. No one's confirmed his existence, but there have been reports over the years. Missing supplies from outfitter camps, strange tracks, a cabin fire spotted from the air that no one could locate on the ground. If someone is out there, and if Anya wandered into his territory, Rossi wrote down Ghost of the North and circled it twice. By dawn, she had a search operation mobilized, 2 helicopter teams, a canine unit, and a ground crew of 12 experienced bush searchers. The search grid covered 400 square kilometers. It was, as Rossi told her team during the morning briefing, like looking for a specific tree in a forest. But they had Anya's route plan, her last known coordinates, and they had the satellite phone signal, which had pinged a tower 63 kilometers north of a research station before going dead. 63 kilometers north. Anya's route plan had her moving south. Someone, or something, had taken Anya in the opposite direction of where she intended to go. The first break came on day 3 of the search. A remote trail camera, mounted by a wildlife research team studying wolverine migration patterns, had captured a single image time-stamped 48 hours after Anya's last check-in. The image was grainy, shot in infrared, but it showed 2 figures moving through a clearing approximately 50 kilometers north of Anya's research station. One figure was smaller, lighter in build, stumbling slightly. The other was taller, broader, moving with the assured gait of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The image was too degraded for facial identification, but the smaller figure was wearing what appeared to be a fleece jacket and hiking pants, consistent with Anya's field clothing. Rossi stared at that image for a long time. 2 figures, one leading, one being led. Anya hadn't fallen into a ravine. She hadn't gotten lost. She'd been taken. The search grid was redrawn, contracted, focused on the area north of the trail camera's position. Lee provided detailed geological maps of the region, highlighting old mining claims, abandoned prospector cabins, and seasonal trapper routes. There were dozens of potential structures scattered across the area, most of them collapsed or reclaimed by the forest. But some, Lee noted, were in locations with natural advantages, sheltered valleys, proximity to water, southern exposure. The kind of places a person might choose if they intended to live off the grid permanently. Rossi dispatched the helicopter teams to conduct low-altitude sweeps of the most promising locations. The weather was deteriorating, a cold front moving in from the northwest, bringing freezing rain and reduced visibility. And she knew that every hour of delay compressed Anya's odds of survival. On the 4th day, one of the helicopter pilots reported a thin column of smoke rising from a clearing in a heavily forested valley, 18 kilometers northeast of the trail camera location. The clearing wasn't on any map. The smoke was consistent with a wood stove. The pilot circled twice, but couldn't see a structure through the canopy. Rossi sent a ground team. Inside the cabin, Anya had spent 4 days doing what geologists do, reading layers. She read the layers of Volkov's routine, the precise times he left to check his trap lines, twice daily, dawn and late afternoon, 45 minutes each, the way he bolted the door from the outside when he left, the path he took through the trees, always the same, always northeast, the route worn into a faint trail by years of repetition. She read the layers of the cabin's construction, the floorboard near the hearth that sat lower than the others, the hairline gap between it and its neighbor, the hollow sound it made when Volkov's boots scuffed across it during his evening pacing. She read the layers of his psychology, The agitation that built throughout the day and crested in the evening, the brief window of calm after he ate, the deep and noisy sleep that took him after midnight, a sleep so heavy it bordered on unconsciousness. And she prepared. The rope binding her wrists had been her first project. Working with a shard of granite she'd palmed from the cabin floor, a fragment of Canadian shield rock, 2 billion years old, now repurposed as a cutting tool. She'd abraded the fibers during the hours Volkov slept. It took 3 nights. By the 4th, the rope was intact enough to look secure, but weak enough that a single sharp pull would snap it. The floorboard was her second project. During Volkov's afternoon trap check on day 4, she knelt by the hearth and worked the board with her fingers. It lifted. Beneath, it was a crawl space, shallow, no more than 18 inches packed earth, extending into darkness. She couldn't tell how far it went, but she could feel cold air moving through it, which meant it opened somewhere. An old foundation vent, perhaps, or a gap where the cabin's sill logs met the ground. It was enough. It was a way out. She replaced the board, smoothed the surrounding dirt, and sat back on the cot. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She forced herself to breathe. She had one chance. If Volkov caught her, she had no illusions about what would happen. The man who had spoken about his lost family with hollow grief was the same man who had dragged her through 3 kilometers of forest with one hand. His capacity for violence was not theoretical. She would go tonight, during the deep sleep. She would snap the rope, lift the board, crawl through the space, and run. She didn't know which direction. She didn't have a compass, a phone, or a map. But she was a geologist who had spent a decade navigating by terrain, and she knew one immutable fact about northern Ontario. If you walk downhill long enough, you hit water. And water leads to people. She waited. Midnight came. The stove ticked as it cooled. Volkov's breathing deepened into the ragged, rhythmic pattern she'd been tracking for 4 nights. She counted to 500 slowly, giving him time to settle into the heaviest phase of sleep. Then she pulled. The rope snapped. The sound was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the cabin, it felt like a gunshot. She froze, her eyes locked on Volkov's shape in the dark. He didn't move. His breathing didn't change. She moved to the hearth on her hands and knees, each movement placed with the precision of someone who had memorized every creaking board in the floor. Her fingers found the edge of a loose plank. She lifted it. The crawl space breathed cold air into her face, damp and earthy, the smell of the ground itself. She lowered herself in. The space was tighter than she'd hoped. Her shoulders scraped the floor joists above. The packed earth pressed against her chest, but she could move. She pulled herself forward on her elbows. Inch by inch, the darkness absolute. The sound of her own breathing enormous in the confined space. After what felt like an hour, but was probably 3 minutes, she felt the air change. Colder, moving. Her outstretched hand touched something solid, a log, the sill of the cabin's foundation wall, and beside it a gap. Narrow. She turned sideways, exhaled every molecule of air in her lungs, and pushed through. She came out into the night. The cold hit her like a wall. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and she was wearing a fleece jacket over a thermal shirt. No gloves, no hat. The sky above the clearing was a field of stars, impossibly bright. The Milky Way a smear of light that would have been beautiful under any other circumstance. The forest pressed in from every side, black and impenetrable. Anya didn't pause to orient herself. She picked the direction that sloped downhill and ran. She ran badly, stumbling over roots, crashing through underbrush, her hands outstretched to fend off branches she couldn't see. The noise she made was catastrophic, a thrashing racket that would carry through the still night air for hundreds of meters. She knew this. She didn't care. Distance was the only thing that mattered now. Every step between her and that cabin was a step toward survival. She didn't hear the cabin door open behind her. She didn't hear Volkov's roar, a sound that was more animal than human, a bellow of rage and loss that scattered birds from the trees for a quarter mile in every direction. She only heard the forest, the hammering of her own heart, and the sound of her boots striking the earth as she ran downhill, toward water, toward the world she'd been stolen from. She ran for over an hour. The terrain was brutal, deadfall, muskeg, rock faces that appeared without warning in the dark, and twice she fell hard enough to taste blood. But she kept moving, always downhill, always following the slope of the land, trusting the geology beneath her feet the way she trusted it her entire career. At approximately 2:30 a.m., though she had no way of knowing the time, she heard it. Water, not a trickle or a seep, but the broad, steady sound of a river moving through a wide channel. She crashed through a final wall of alder brush and stumbled onto a gravel bank, the water black and gleaming in the starlight, the far bank a dark line 50 meters away. She followed the river south. It was easier going on the gravel bars, and the open sky above the water gave her enough light to see the worst obstacles. She was shaking violently now, from cold, from adrenaline, from the sustained effort of moving through wilderness in the dark. But she kept walking. At first light, she saw the helicopter. It was low, following the river valley, its rotors chopping the morning silence into rhythmic thunder. A search helicopter, she realized. RCMP markings on the fuselage, a spotter in the open side door scanning the banks with binoculars. Anya stepped into the open, into the middle of the gravel bar, and raised both arms above her head. The helicopter banked, circled, and descended. When the skids touched gravel and a paramedic jumped out, Anya Petrova dropped to her knees. Not from exhaustion, though she was exhausted. Not from relief, though the relief was so enormous it felt like a physical force pressing her into the ground. She dropped because for the first time in 6 days, she was no longer alone, and the weight of what she'd survived could finally be set down. "My name is Anya Petrova," she said. Her voice was raw, cracked, barely above a whisper. "There's a man, a cabin, north of here. His name is Dmitry Volkov." The paramedic wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders. The spotter was already on the radio, relaying coordinates. Within 20 minutes, 2 additional RCMP helicopters were in the air, converging on the valley north of Anya's position. Sergeant Elena Rossi received the call at 6:12 a.m. She was in the command post. She hadn't left it in 36 hours, drinking her 9th coffee and staring at the same map she'd been staring at all week. When the radio crackled with the words "subject located, alive, requesting immediate extraction and suspect pursuit," she set the coffee down, closed her eyes, and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of something that felt like gratitude. Then she picked up the radio and went to work. Volkov cabin was located at 7:45 a.m. The ground team approached on foot through dense bush, guided by the helicopter overhead. They found the cabin exactly as Anya had described, a rough-hewn structure in a clearing, no road, no trail, invisible from the air beneath the canopy. The door was open. Inside, they found the cot, the rope snapped cleanly, the lifted floorboard, and the crawl space still marked with the tracks of Anya's elbows in the dirt. Volkov himself was gone. He'd pursued Anya into the forest. The tracks made that clear, his heavy boot prints following her path downhill for approximately 2 kilometers before veering east away from the river into some of the densest bush in the region. The canine unit picked up his scent at the divergence point and followed it for 6 hours through terrain that would have stopped most people. Cliff bands, swamps, blowdown, so thick the dogs had to be lifted over. They found him at 3:17 p.m., sitting on a rock ledge overlooking a lake that had no name on any map. He was motionless, his hands on his knees, staring out at the water. He didn't run when the officers emerged from the tree line. He didn't resist when they approached. He turned his head, looked at them with those deep-set dark eyes, and said a single sentence in his grinding, accented English. She was not supposed to leave. He was arrested and transported to the Thunder Bay detachment, where he was charged with kidnapping, forcible confinement, and assault. In the weeks that followed, the investigation pieced together the full picture of Dmitry Volkov's history. He had entered Canada in 1998 on a temporary work visa sponsored by a mining company in Sudbury. He'd worked the mines for 2 years before his visa expired, and he failed to renew it. Immigration records showed a series of failed applications, each one more desperate than the last, each one denied. His wife and young daughter, still in Kharkiv, had applied for family reunification visas 3 times. All 3 were rejected. By 2003, Volkov had stopped appearing in any official records. No tax filings, no health card usage, no address. He had walked into the bush and built a life, if you could call it a life, entirely off the grid. The cabin, forensic analysis later determined, had been constructed over a period of several years, expanded and reinforced as Volkov's commitment to his isolation people. He trapped, foraged, and made infrequent trips to distant gas stations and hardware stores, paying in cash, speaking to no one. For nearly 20 years, Dmitry Volkov had been a ghost inhabiting a stretch of forest that the rest of the world had forgotten. When Anya Petrova arrived with her sensors and her permits and her satellite phone, with all the apparatus of a civilization that had rejected him, something inside him cracked. Not snapped, cracked. The distinction mattered because it meant the break had been forming for years, widening imperceptibly under the pressure of solitude and loss. And Anya's presence had simply been the final stress that the fracture couldn't absorb. He told the investigating officers, in halting, fragmented statements, that he hadn't intended to harm her. He had intended to keep her. The difference, in his mind, was vast. In the eyes of the law, it was irrelevant. Anya Petrova gave her full statement from a hospital bed in Thunder Bay, where she was treated for dehydration, hypothermia, lacerations on both wrists and forearms, and a hairline fracture to her left radius sustained during the initial abduction. Michael Chan was beside her, holding her hand, his face carrying the particular expression of a person who has been given back something they had already begun to grieve. Dr. Jin Lee visited the following day, bringing geological survey maps that Anya hadn't asked for, but immediately spread across the hospital blankets, tracing the kimberlite formations with a finger that still trembled. Lee watched her work and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You know you don't have to go back out there." Anya looked up at him. Her blue eyes, ringed with exhaustion, held something that wasn't defiance exactly, but was adjacent to it. The quiet insistence of a person who refuses to let the worst thing that happened to them become the thing that defines them. "I know," she said, "but the data is still out there, and so are the formations." Lee smiled. It was a sad smile, but a real one. Sergeant Rossi closed the Petrova file on a Thursday afternoon, for months after it had landed on her desk. The charges against Volkov had been formalized, the evidence cataloged, the statements recorded. The trial was scheduled for the following spring. She added her final notes, signed the last page, and placed the file in the cabinet with the others. Then she stood at her office window and looked north, toward the vast green expanse that stretched beyond the city limits, beyond the highways, beyond the reach of roads and satellites and law. Somewhere out there, the cabin still stood in its clearing, empty now, the door hanging open, the stove cold, the crawl space still bearing the marks of a woman who had refused to disappear. The forest didn't care. The forest had been there for 10,000 years and would be there for 10,000 more, indifferent to the dramas played out beneath its canopy. But Elena Rossi cared, and Anya Petrova, sitting in a hospital bed in Thunder Bay with survey maps spread across her lap and a fracture in her arm and a future she'd fought to keep, cared. And sometimes in the face of a wilderness that vast and a silence that deep, caring is the most defiant thing a person can do.